Welcome back once again. We've been talking about the book of Revelation and some of the things that have come after. A few weeks ago we laid some groundwork on some of the terms and stuff that we're going to use. And then last week we talked about the seven churches that are not just seven literal churches, but they also represent church ages or churches that are present today. And so today we're going to pick up and talk about what comes after chapter number 3, where God's dealing with the churches. And the first thing John hears is he says, I beheld and saw a door open in heaven. And a voice spoke with him. It was the trumpet speaking to him. And it said, come up hither and I will show you things which must be hereafter. And that's quite interesting because it's at that point right there where a lot of people get this idea of the rapture. Now you might be out there, if you're out there and you're saying, well, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no word called rapture in the Bible. You'd be absolutely correct. In the English Bible, there is no word rapture. But there's also no word for theology. Yet we're talking about theology. So I'm just going to go on and talk about what is in Scripture, though. Because if you go back to a verse which is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse number 16, he's talking about the church or the people of God being caught up. And the word for caught up in the Greek is rapturos, which is the Greek version of where we get our English word rapture. So technically the word is in Scripture. It's just not, for if you're out there reading a general Bible, you probably don't see it right away. But what's being taught here is that at some point the church is caught up, much like we see an Old Testament reference in the man Enoch. You know, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. What's that? The literal interpretation of that is at some point while he was walking, God just snatched him up and took him to heaven. And so when you're looking at that and you're realizing that, he's also now talking about the church being that way. Well, where in Revelation does that fall? Well, it's interesting because after John addresses the seven churches in between Revelation 1 and Revelation 3, he has this Revelation 4 where he sees a door in heaven and it says, come up hither, and he goes up hither to see things which must be hereafter. The church is never mentioned again on earth. The only time you see the church is in things in heaven. The marriage supper of the Lamb, the judgment seat of Christ. We're going to be talking about the judgment seat of Christ in a video coming up soon. But the church is never mentioned again on earth. And you're like, well, there's 144,000 on earth. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks as well. But the fact is, the church itself, the believers who are saved by grace, are not mentioned again after chapter 3. And so they believe the rapture of the church takes place here with John being figuratively taken up in his revelation. But that's representative of the church being taken up. You might say, well, what exactly is this idea of the rapture? Well, I touched on it in last week's lesson a little bit. Of the predispensational viewpoint is that there's this idea found in Daniel chapter 9. And for those of you who are familiar with prophecy, you know Daniel is a major Old Testament reference of prophecy. There's a lot of prophecies found there. But of the prophecies found in Daniel, about half of them are found in Daniel chapter 7. Well, in Daniel 9, he gets a revelation and a prophecy, and he's speaking to Israel. And he's talking about that there's going to be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. Another week. So there's a 70-week, what would you say? You'd probably refer to it as a trial period or a testing period. That God is telling Israel, hey, because of the things you've gone through or because of the things you're facing, I'm going to be dealing with you. And so I'm just going to get this little card out I have here and talk about what's going on. Is God is going to be dealing with Israel. He's telling them he's going to be dealing with them. It's much like if you're out and about in the town and you have kids out there, or you were a kid and your dad or mom ever said, well, I'll deal with you when I get home. That was one of the worst things my brother and I wanted to hear from my dad. Was, I'll deal with you when I get home, because we knew there was a waiting time before we actually got being dealt with. That was probably worse than the actual punishment. Sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes the punishment was pretty bad. But besides that, that's what God's telling Israel here. It says, hey, look, I'm going to be dealing with you for a number of times. Well, when it says weeks, it more or less means groupings of 7. So I'm going to just kind of give you a little math here. You don't have to, be an expert to understand this. Is when it talks about these 70 weeks, it's talking about weeks of years. So you have 7 weeks, which is 7-year increments. So every 7 year set, so let's say if you wanted to live dog years, reverse dog years. There's 7 human years or 7 dog years in a human year. You got to think 7 years for a human, okay? That is 1 week in God's timing. So when he deals with Israel, he says, look, there's going to be 7 weeks. That would be 49 years. 7 times 7 is 49. And then he begins to deal with them again about things that are come, and he says there's going to be 62 weeks. Well, 62 times 7 is 434 years of being dealt with. And so you have this point from the time that God dealt with Israel about restoring the temple, which was roughly about 455 BC, or for those of you who are now the modern interpretation, BCE. You've got 455 BC, so 455 years before 0. And then, so you've got these 49 years, so 7 weeks that God deals with Israel, and then another 62 weeks where he's dealing with them from the prophecy given about the temple being rebuilt to it actually happening. A total of 483 years. So you've got 455 years till 0, and then another 29 years after 0. So now you're at 29 AD, or if you're of the new modern translation, you're at 29 CE. That was about the time Christ was baptized and began his public ministry. Give or take a year or so. So in reality, you have 69 weeks from the time God says, hey, I'm going to begin dealing with Israel to the time Christ comes to establish the church. That's 69 weeks. And so of the 79, or not 79, of the 70 years, you have 69 of them that have been accomplished. Well, where's the last week? Well, you have this idea of the mystery, or the unknown application, the pause button on God's time, and that was him dealing with the church. We talked about the church in last week's lesson. So you have from the time Christ began his public ministry until Revelation chapter 4, where the church was dealt with, where the church had its time to reach the lost, where the church had the time of the gospel. And then Revelation 4 happens, and the church is no longer mentioned because God begins the last week of dealing with Israel. Well, what's the last week? We just said it's groupings of 7 years. How long is tribulation? 7 years. So we have this last week where God's going to be dealing with the church. So the whole point of the rapture theory, that the church is going to be caught up, is so that way the church can be removed, or as it says in Scripture, the restrainer, he who letteth that will let. That is God's Spirit, the power of his Spirit, moving through the application of the church, which is holding back the events from unfolding to dealing with Israel, or from Satan himself bringing destruction. So when this rapture happens, what exactly goes on, and what exactly is meant by the rapture theory? Well, if you notice in pop culture today, I'm not going to get too far into it, but you would think that if a lot of people went missing all of a sudden because they were taken away or just vanished like that, there'd be some confusion or mishaps. Well, ever since about the 1970s, maybe the 1960s, there's been a lot of sci-fi movies put out, and if you're a huge comic book fan, you know there's movies left and right. It would not be very hard for people to explain what happened to all these people now. You've got so many people believing things, and it even talks about, in Revelation, John sees this man speak, and out of his mouth comes these green frogs. It's a mysterious thing for people to look at, but if you think of it today, it's no wonder, a man could come on the scene and give a simple explanation that, a thought of aliens maybe, or some mass hysteria or something, and people would just eat it up. Not only that, but if you don't have the church, if you don't have the gospel being proclaimed, people will cleave to anything that gives them hope. It wouldn't be hard for them to believe something like that. So you're saying, well, how could all these people disappear and people not know about the rapture? Well, it's because, as it says in the New Testament, a strong delusion is going to be brought on them. It means that, now that God's truth is no longer being revealed, people's minds are going to be given over to whatever they're being told is right, or whatever they're being told is true. It's much like if you're really into politics, and I hate to get into politics. I probably don't hate getting into politics, but it's probably not the best example. But if you remove Fox News, all you'd have is liberal media. The fact that I'm not saying Fox News is truth. They probably have a lot of truth in them, a lot more than other ones, but I'm not saying the truth. But if you remove Fox News, you have a biased newscast out there. Okay? If you remove, if you're talking about the sports channel and you remove, any type of referee from a sports game, there's going to be chaos in the field because there's no rules or governing there. Well, when the church gets removed, the testimony of the gospel gets removed, people are going to be turning whichever way they can. And so when the rapture of the church takes place, it's not going to be hard for them to explain it away. You look at our generation today, if you actually look into it, I looked into it a while back, and there is a lot of missing persons cases that have never been solved. And I'm not saying that attributes to the rapture. What I'm saying is, after a certain amount of time, people become numb to it. It's just like, oh yeah, it's just another missing person case. It's not going to be very hard for all of a sudden all these people to just go disappearing, that someone comes on the scene and says, oh, well, they just all moved to Mars because, they got bored of Earth. It's not going to be hard for people to believe into something because they want to believe it. It's easier for them to believe it. So this idea of the rapture isn't too far-fetched, especially in our modern time of it happening. But the important part to know about the rapture of the church is you need to be prepared for it. Because the things that follow are going to be dealing with Israel, not with Gentile people. It's going to be primarily meant for Israel to be saved, for Israel to be purged. So if you're thinking that, well, if I miss the rapture, I'll just get right with God, chances are, if you weren't committed to Christ before the rapture, it's not going to be any easier after the rapture for you. So what you need to do is you need to get back in church, get right with God, go to your C3 church this next week, and just begin to worship Christ like you always do, and be prepared for what may come.